or any other state that made promises that it clearly cannot keep. To do so would be more than unfair. It would be immoral. A federal bailout cannot happen, and it will not happen. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran. We understand that Isfahan Aram Mashahi, the Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's chief of staff, will be arriving in the United States as soon as tomorrow. Mr. Mashahi is a close friend and trusted advisor of President Ahmadinejad. He is someone who has worked closely with President Ahmadinejad since 1982, when Ahmadinejad was governor in Koy in West Azerbaijan, and the Intelligence Ministry appointed Mashahi as the security team for the Kurdistan region next door. Since then, Mashahi has been a member of the Ahmadinejad inner circle. The world knows of President Ahmadinejad's public incitement against Jews and Israel, infamously including his pledge to, quote, wipe Israel off the face of the map. But the world may not know of the virulent anti-Israel and anti-Semitic views of his trusted advisor. In 2008, Mr. Mashahi told Sudanese President Bashir, quote, the corrupt and criminal Zionist regime is harming not only the Arab and Islamic world, but humanity in its entirety. In order to save humanity from its different crises, there is no other way other than limiting of Zionist influence on human society, because the root and origin of most of the world's current crises are related to Zionism. Shortly after the discredited Iranian presidential election of June 2009, Mr. Mashahi was appointed as the presidential chief of staff after a very brief and unsuccessful attempt to serve as the vice president of Iran. Since then, the persecution and repression of people in Iran has steadily increased. Thousands of peaceful protesters, dissidents, and activists have been detained after Mr. Mashahi became chief of staff. Now, let there be no doubt, Mr. Mashahi, like his president, is directly responsible for human rights abuses in Iran. He should not be granted a visa to enter the United States of America, and he, like his president, should be designated under U.S. law as a human rights abuser in Iran. Mr. Mashahi's visit will come just 4 days after the United Nations Secretary General released an interim report on human rights in Iran. The report states, quote, "The human rights situation in Iran has been marked by intensified crackdowns on human rights defenders, women's rights activists, journalists, and government opponents. Concerns about torture, arbitrary detentions, and unfair trials continue to be raised by UN human rights mechanisms. Additionally, they said, discrimination persisted against minority groups and in some cases amounting to persecution. They said, quote, "A worrying trend is the increased number of cases in which political prisoners are accused of moharib, that is, enmity against God, an offense which under their law is punishable by death. At least 22 people charged with the moharib have been executed since January 2010 under this man's administration. Journalists, bloggers, human rights defenders, and lawyers continue to be arrested or subjected to travel bans. Blogs and websites are restricted. And now there are more than 10 national dailies that have been shut down and refused because they refused to toe the official line under this man. The concern remains over the lack of human rights, due process rights, and a failure to respect any of the rights of detainees. Particularly, the UN wrote, there are concerns expressed at routine practice of incommunicado detention, the use of torture, ill treatment and detention, the use of solitary confinement, and of individuals without any charge. Finally, they said, quote, concerns were expressed in public about people sentenced to death, often who do not have access to any legal representation, and families and lawyers are not even informed of the execution. The report continues to detail Iranian persecution of religious minorities, especially those of the Baha'i faith. The report notes a concern for 6 members of the Baha'i community arrested by officials from the intelligence ministry in the months of June and July 2010, and 7 Baha'i community leaders recently sentenced to 10 years in prison. Regarding Iran's persecution of the Kurdish minority, the report notes, quote, members of the Kurdish community have continued to be executed on various national security-related charges, including moharib. At least 9 Kurdish political prisoners, including Jafar Kazemi, Mohammed Ali Agagi, and Ali Saraemi, were executed since 2010, and several others remain at risk of execution. Regarding Iran's persecution of Christians, we read the report also continues to be received about Christians, in particular converts, being subjected to arbitrary arrest and harassment. The Secretary General's report follows others by our own State Department and human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. While we expect the State Department to release its 2010 Country Human Rights Report on March 25th, here are a few highlights from their 2009 report on Iran. They said, quote, security forces were implicated in custodial deaths and killings of election protesters and committed other acts of politically motivated violence, including torture, beatings, and rape. The State Department wrote the government administered severely officially sanctioned punishments, including death by stoning, amputation, and flogging. Authorities responded to all demonstrations with raids on opposition activist offices. They wrote some prison facilities, including the infamous Evin prison in Tehran, were notorious for cruel and prolonged torture of political opponents of the government. Authorities also maintained, quote, unofficial, unquote, secret prisons and detention centers outside the national prison system where abuse regularly occurred. The government reportedly used torture, including prolonged solitary confinement and extreme sensory deprivation, especially on political prisoners, often in detention centers outside the control of prison authorities, including Section 209 of Evin Prison. The government threatened, harassed, and arrested individuals who posted comments critical of the government on the Internet, and in some cases it reportedly confiscated passports or arrested family members. These are all official comments by our own State Department on the human rights situation in Iran just in 2009 as this man administered the Chief of Staff's office. But Amnesty International also added its voice. The 2010 report on human rights in Iran states with the following summary, quote, an intensified clampdown on political protest proceeded, and particularly following the presidential election in June, whose outcome was widely disputed, deepening the long-standing patterns of repression. Security forces, particularly the paramilitary Basij, used excessive force against demonstrators. Dozens of people were killed or fatally injured. Authorities suppressed freedom of expression to an unprecedented level, blocking mobile and terrestrial phone networks and Internet communications. Well over 5,000 people have been detained by the end of the year. Many were tortured, including some who were alleged to have been raped in detention or otherwise ill-treated. Some died of their injuries. Dozens were then prosecuted in grossly unfair mass show trials. Most were sentenced to prison terms, but at least 6 were sentenced to death. Amnesty goes on. The election-related violations occurred against a background of severe repression, which persisted through 2009 and whose victims included members of ethnic and religious minorities, students, human rights defenders, and advocates of political reform. Women continued to face severe discrimination under the law and in practice, and women's rights campaigners were harassed, arrested, and imprisoned. Torture and other ill treatment of detainees remain rife, and at least 12 people died in custody. Detainees were systematically denied access to lawyers, medical care, and their families, and many faced unfair trials. Now, other groups have weighed in, particularly Human Rights Watch, who wrote in their 2011 report, quote, Iran's human rights crisis deepened as the government sought to consolidate its power following the 2009 disputed presidential election. Public demonstrations waned after security forces used live ammunition to suppress protesters in late 2009, resulting in the death of at least 7 protesters. And I would add, we all remember Nada, who was killed online. Authorities announced their security forces had arrested more than 6,000 individuals after June 2009. Hundreds, including lawyers, rights defenders, journalists, civil society activists, and opposition leaders, remain in detention without charge. Since the election crackdown last year, well over 1,000 people have fled Iran to seek asylum in neighboring countries. Interrogators used torture to extract confessions, and the judiciary relied on sentencing people to long prison terms and death sentences. Restrictions on freedom of expression and association as well as religious and other gender-based discrimination, continue unabated. The report continued, authorities systemically use torture to coerce confessions. Student activist Abdullah Momeni wrote to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei in September describing the torture he suffered at the hands of jailers. At this writing, no high-level official has been prosecuted for torture, ill-treatment, and deaths of the 3 detainees held at Kazrak Detention Center after June 2009. We should not let these violations go unnoticed, nor can we continue to turn a blind eye to countless prisoners of conscience fighting for basic human dignity under this brutal dictatorship. It's time we make a stand for people like Nasreen Sotoudeh, detained for her work as a human rights lawyer, a human rights activist, and defender of children who face capital charges. Hossein Ronagi Mayalig, who is detained for his work as a blogger and human rights activist. He has been refused medical treatment despite kidney failure. Fariba Kalambadi, Jamal Mukin Kanjani, Afif Naimi, Saeed Razaei, Behruz Tav Akholi, Vahid Tizfam, and Mavash Sabet. These are all detained leaders of the Baha'i community, jailed solely for their Baha'i faith. Now, as of today, the precise whereabouts of opposition leaders, Mehdi Karoubi and Mir Hossein Mousavi, and their respective wives, remain unknown following their arrests and detention in February. Meanwhile, according to international human rights organizations, the whereabouts of hundreds of Iranians, including journalists and political activists, arrested just before the February 14th opposition protests remain unknown. To each of them, I would echo President Reagan's words. I came here to give you strength, but it is you who have strengthened me. Now, as we approach Iran's New Year's celebration of Nowruz, it's important for the President to demonstrate our administration's commitment to the human rights of the people of Iran. We know that the Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and the Iranian Presidential Chief of Staff Mashai and other senior government officials are directly responsible and complicit in ordering, controlling, or otherwise directing the commission of serious human rights abuses against the people of Iran on or after June 12, 2009. Now, pursuant to Executive Order 13553 and the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2010, the President should designate these individuals as human rights abusers and affirm core American values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. And I would just end by quoting from Section 105 of the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2010, signed by the President into law last year. It requires that the executive branch produce a list of persons who are responsible or complicit in certain human rights abuses. It says not later than 90 days after the enactment of this act, the President shall submit to appropriate congressional committees a list of persons who are officials of the government of Iran or persons acting on behalf of the government, including members of paramilitary organizations such as Ansar-e-Hezbollah and the Bashji Mostafin, that the President determines, based on credible evidence, are responsible for or complicit in or responsible for ordering, controlling, or otherwise directing the commission of serious human rights abuses against the citizens of Iran or their family members on or after June 12, 2009, regardless of whether such abuses occurred in Iran or not. Clearly, this official about to arrive in the United States meets the standard under Section 105 of CISADA, and the U.S. administration should designate him as an abuser of human rights. He should not be admitted entry into the United States, and we should call it the way we see it, which is this is one of the most dangerous and human rights abusing officials that we know of. Comprehensive data now exists from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, even from the United Nations on what this man has directed. He should not be given a visa, and he should be so listed under U.S. law. And with that, I yield back. And would suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
The senator from Missouri.
I move to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak on an issue that I feel like I've spent a lot of time talking about in recent years, but without much effect on either of the last two administrations. This is the issue of the Iran Sanctions Act. Congress has worked in a bipartisan way to strengthen and expand the Iran Sanctions Act, but in spite of our repeated efforts, the administration just hasn't been willing to use the tools that the Congress has given them. In my mind, and I'm sure in the minds of a great many of my colleagues, nothing would be more destabilizing to the Mideast region and to Middle Eastern regional security or global security than Iran's development of a nuclear weapon. I won't spend a lot of time here talking about why that is, because I doubt there's any member of this body that isn't aware of how dangerous this situation is or could be, which is why it's even more frustrating that we haven't been able to get the administration to push a more robust set of sanctions using the sanction policy and the sanction tools that we've given them. During the 15 years between the time the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act was passed in 1996 and last year, no meaningful applications of these sanctions was ever adopted. From 1996 until last year, no meaningful application has ever been adopted. In 2006, I worked closely with the Bush administration to pass a bill known as the Iran Freedom Support Act to improve the menu and the choices of sanctions available to that administration and future administrations. Under that bill, Congress codified some of the executive actions that President Clinton and President Bush appropriately took and ensured that these tools became more permanent. Last year, alarmed again at the administration's disinterest in using the sanctions available to it, Congress again acted to tighten our sanctions policy. The Congress sunsetted the State Department's period of investigatory review to ensure that once an investigation is launched, it has to be concluded. It's now up to the Obama administration to pursue a vigorous sanctions policy that sends the message to Iran that you are isolated in the world and the world will not tolerate this nuclear program. On March 26, 2009, I sent a letter to Secretary Clinton asking for clarification on why the administration had not fully implemented sanctions against Iran. I sent a similar letter to Secretary Rice in 2007, suggesting, in fact, stating that the Bush administration was similarly delinquent in its enforcement efforts. We have given them the tools, but simply these administrations in both cases have not used those tools. Fortunately, we now see the first indications that we are beginning to head in the right direction. Last fall, the State Department announced sanctions against Naftaran, a Swiss subsidiary of the National Iranian Oil Company. And in a appearance before the Senate that I was a few days ago, I was positive about my sense that this was a big step in the right direction, but really only one step. Since the Iran Sanctions Act, this is the first time ever, Mr. President, that the act has been used. And I'm pleased it's been used, but remember, it's the first time ever it's been used. This act, to make it even more important that it is being used and frustrating that it hasn't been used, this action by the State Department had immediate effect, as I and many others have been suggesting that it would since the passage of these tools to the administration. Within days of the State Department's actions against Naftaran, and according to news reports at the time, European firms such as Royal Dutch Shale, Total, State Oil, and Italy ENI announced they would pull operations out of Iran's energy sector. Exactly the kind of impact that the Congress had hoped that this would have. On September the 29th, 2010, Deputy Secretary Steinberg announced the State Department's initiation of investigations into international firms that had not yet committed to exit Iran's petroleum sector. While the full list of these firms remains classified, publicly available reports suggest that list includes at least a dozen firms, many of which are Chinese, including the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company, Chinese National Petroleum Company, and Unipec. Other firms come from Germany, from Turkey, and from Venezuela. The list also includes the Industrial Bank of China, the China Construction Bank, the Agricultural Bank of China, and the Bank of China, which are reportedly providing financial services to Iranian interests in violation of the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Act. Under the law that now governs our sanctions policy, the State Department has 6 months to complete these investigations before announcing whether these entities will face sanctions. These notifications are due by March the 29th of this year. I'm very hopeful that the State Department report sends the right message on March the 29th. It's been a long time for those of us who have advocated that this kind of action would produce the right kind of results. U.S. sanction policy should complement the international sanctions effort underway at the UN and other international venues. There is no reason that we can't pursue a strategic sanctions policy that ensures that companies operating in the United States or affiliated with U.S. entities don't invest in Iran's energy sector. It's time we demonstrated that we're really serious about this before it's too late. We have taken now the first step in the right direction. It's produced exactly the results we had hoped those steps would take, and now I and others anxiously await the report that will come out between now and March the 29th to see what the next steps are, and then we'll be looking carefully to see what the reaction to those actions are. I hope that we do continue to show that we're really serious, that sanctions will only work if the nations involved, and particularly the United States, follows its own policies and uses its own tools. Madam President, I notice the absence of a quorum as I conclude my remarks.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
that proceedings under the Quorum Call be dispensed with?
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I have come to the floor this evening to discuss America's tremendous natural resource potential and to again highlight the fact that if we choose to, we can absolutely produce more of our energy to meet more of our nation's needs. I also want to address an argument that is often made in opposition to new domestic production, because I believe that each and every member of this chamber needs to know the facts and the consequences of our current approach. Without a doubt, understanding how much energy we have is at the very foundation of an energy policy. And Madam President, you sit on the Energy Committee with me. We talk about our nation's energy policy. We talk about an all of the above, a balanced energy portfolio. So it is important to understand what it is that we have. For resources like wind and solar, it's pretty easy. They're renewable, so theoretically we should never run out. But for conventional resources, which make up about 83% of the energy that America consumes, it's a different story. Oil and natural gas and coal aren't located on the surface of the earth, so we don't exactly know what it is that we have and where we have it. We got to look around for it. Finding and quantifying our resources is a tough enough task. Adding to the complexity is the litany of the technical terms that are used to describe them. They're proved resources, probable reserves, possible reserves, unproved reserves, and our demonstrated reserve base. And then we move into the resources, which are different from the reserves, and that list includes 8 more categories, and every one of them means something different. And I'd imagine that most people don't have a great understanding of these terms, and by and large, I suppose that's fine, unless you happen to be a member of the United States Senate, because we are tasked with helping to formulate our nation's energy policy. We need to know the details and the distinctions. Before we make critical decisions that affect the price and the source of our energy supply, it's our responsibility to know what our experts think that we actually have in this country. To help gain a better understanding of our nation's energy base, Senator Inhofe of Oklahoma and I requested a report from the Congressional Research Service. The report was first released back in October of 2009. And then just in November, the CRS experts updated that report. And it's entitled, U.S. Fossil Fuel Resources Terminology, Reporting, and Summary. Fascinating, I'm sure. It actually is fascinating. And it should be required reading for each and every member of the Senate. Education is not the only reason that we released this report, though. We also hope that it will help to set the record straight. Too many of the facts presented here, particularly about energy, are based upon foregone conclusions. And in some people's minds, we're supposedly running out of oil, well, because we've always been running out of oil. So at our request, CRS also surveyed existing government estimates to determine just exactly how much conventional energy that we think we might really have. And I think most would find the results surprising. The truth is, our experts don't believe that we are on the verge of running out of oil, out of natural gas, or of coal. Far from it. According to the government's own estimates, the United States actually has the largest fossil fuel endowment in the world. That's worth repeating. Here in the United States, we have the largest fossil fuel endowment in the world, larger than Russia, far larger than countries like Saudi Arabia and China. And within our own endowment is an incredible source of oil, an estimated 163 billion barrels of technically recoverable resources. Again, going back to that terminology. But this 163 billion barrels of technically recovered resources would be enough to maintain current production for more than 60 years. We have huge volumes of natural gas, potentially more than 2,000 trillion cubic feet. which would last for 90 years at today's rate of consumption. And our coal resources, Madam President, our coal resources are truly unrivaled. At 264 billion short tons, our supply will last for more than 200 years. I'll put up a chart here that kind of speaks to what we're looking at in terms of proven reserves and recoverable reserves when we're talking about oil. Back to the CRS report, they found that we have a tremendous range of sub-economic resources that are not yet commercialized, including an estimated 100 billion barrels of heavy oil, more than 800 billion barrels of shale oil, and up to 320,000 trillion cubic feet of methane hydrates. Now, for oil shale, that's over 100 years' worth of conventional oil. For methane hydrates, that could be an amazing 14,000 years' worth of natural gas if we endeavor to find ways to produce it. Looking at the chart, because I'm throwing out a lot of numbers, a lot of years, it's kind of tough to get your arms around all of it. But if you look to the share of proven reserves only within our country, it's about 28 billion barrels of oil, 17%. The rest of America's recoverable oil, or 135 billion barrels, 83% of what it is estimated that we have within this country are reserves that are, for all intents and purposes, off limits to us. So the share of proven reserves that we're talking about, the 17% versus the 83% of recoverable oil that is off limits to us. The numbers in the CRS report are our best experts' best estimates on how much we have out there, how much oil, how much natural gas, how much coal, and the unconventional fossil fuels that lie here within the United States. And these numbers can be obtained by anybody who works in Congress, anybody who's capable of navigating on my website. Go to Senator Inhofe's website. And I do hope that, that members here in the chamber will make good use of them. Because not only does this report provide objective figures for the Senate to use, it also casts serious doubt on many of the false arguments that are made against new domestic production. And so I think it's important to recognize, again, what it is that we have. This is not any classified secret. These are the reserves that we know that exist. I want to give a couple specifics here, if I might. When we hear about some of the language or the statements that are made and are accepted as fact, there's a claim that's heard regularly here on the Senate floor. I even heard it used by the President last week when he said that the United States has just 2% of the world's oil reserves but consumes 25% of the world's oil. Well, that line is designed to make its audience think that the United States is both running out of oil and also using oil at an unsustainable rate. But the truth is, government officials have claimed that here in the United States, we've been running out of oil since about 1919, but we're still the world's third largest producer, behind Russia, behind Saudi Arabia, but we're well ahead of everybody else. So if you think back to the categories that I named earlier, and I'm talking about the different categories of reserves, you can see why simply referring to reserves is misleading, because those account for only a very small sliver of our total oil. So to classify a barrel of oil as a reserve, you literally have to drill and prove that it is there. And so by definition, that excludes all the lands that have never been explored. So that's the big chunk of the pie here. It excludes a huge range of places where we believe there is oil, and in the end, it dramatically underestimates our nation's oil resources. Consider this. The United States proved oil reserves. The share of proven reserves over here, the 17%, our proved oil reserves have never exceeded 40 billion barrels. But over the past 110 years that the United States have been producing, we have managed to produce nearly 200 billion barrels of oil. So on the books, we say there's only 40 billion barrels, but we've been producing nearly 200 billion barrels of oil over the past century. That alone should cast the doubt on the words of so many. So arguing that we have just 2% of the world's oil is like arguing that your checking account, but not your much larger savings account, counts only towards your net worth. I'm only going to count what's in my checking account. I'm not going to count what's in my savings account. But in reality, I have all of this. I have the whole combination. The reality is if you've got money in both accounts, neither provides a complete picture by itself. Oil is much the same way. Between 2008 and 2009, our reserves actually rose by more than 8%, even as we produced about 2 billion barrels of oil, and that was made possible by our substantial resource base. So why claim that America is running out of oil when it's not the case? The easiest explanation is that it's an attempt to turn perception into reality. If Americans can be convinced that we have no oil, we'll stop demanding that our government allow access to it. Instead of running out of oil, we'll simply stop producing it. And in some people's minds, regardless of the economic consequences, the end result will be the same. And the reason I'm so encouraged by this CRS resource report and why I am encouraging other members to review it, and the reason that I'm so disappointed by continued claims that America has nearly exhausted its resource wealth, is that an understanding of our true energy potential helps point the way to a viable national policy. Instead of locking up our lands, we need to open them up. We need to streamline access, streamline permitting, and bring more of our own resources to market. And doing so will not only allow us to increase domestic production, but also decrease domestic consumption. And these steps aren't mutually exclusive. Given our energy and our fiscal challenges, they're actually dependent on one another. And let me put it into context a different way. For years, Alaska's congressional delegation has sought to allow 2,000 acres of the non-wilderness portion of ANWR to be opened to development. And usually when we talk about ANWR, we talk about how much new oil production could result, probably somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million barrels a day. Truly, that would help us out at this time. But left out of that conversation are the tremendous revenues that would accrue to the federal government. According to CRS, those revenues would reach more than $150 billion. I'll repeat the number again because we're looking for dollars around here. $150 billion at today's oil prices. And if we use those revenues wisely, we could make great progress, serious project on deficit reduction and serious investments in new technologies. Right now, there is a bill from the Michigan delegation that would increase the incentives for electric vehicles by an estimated $19 billion. Great idea. But the problem, the reason the bill is not going to go anywhere is there's just no way to be paying for it right now. Now think about what would happen if we brought ANWR into the conversation. We could fully fund incentives to put not just a couple million, but upwards of 20 million electric vehicles on the road. We could help create an entire industry, even as we fully protect our most valuable resource, which is the American taxpayer. At the end of the day, our decision to produce more of our own oil would be matched by a tremendous reduction in our oil consumption, thanks to the advanced vehicles that we deploy from the revenues from oil production. But by holding back production, we hold back progress. And for far too long, I believe that anti-production arguments have prevented Congress from developing a coherent energy policy. We see them again today. They say, oh, it's the speculators, or oh, producers aren't using the lands that they've already leased. That's all. But today we're also seeing the consequences of those arguments. Higher gasoline prices, a weaker economy, and a loss of international standing. And the longer our nation waits to develop its resources, the longer we wait to create new jobs, to improve our energy security, to pay down the debt, to invest in next-generation technologies. The longer we decide it's acceptable to import oil instead of producing our own, the longer we will continue to export our wealth, export our jobs, and the other benefits of production to other nations. CRS's new report on America's true energy potential should, I think, be an eye-opener to us, and I intend to circulate a copy to every Senate office. I would ask that my colleagues take just a few minutes, look through this report, understand what it means for our energy policy, and then join me to make sure that this Congress takes advantage of the opportunity that it presents. Madam President, I see that the Majority Leader is on the floor. I have a short statement recognizing the phenomenal historical win of the Iditarod race. John Baker, an Inupiaq Eskimo out of Kotzebue, the first Alaska Native to win the Iditarod in 35 years. The Iditarod has been around for 39 years. He made it to Nome on the 1,000-mile-plus Iditarod Trail. He made it to Nome in record time, 8 days, 19 hours, 46 minutes, and 39 seconds on the trail, the fastest time in the Iditarod history. We are exceptionally, exceptionally proud of John Baker, and I have a statement that I will submit in its entirety into the record. I had an opportunity to be with John Baker and his phenomenal dog team as they were preparing to leave from Anchorage 2 weeks ago. And John said, it's my time, Lisa, it's my time. And he has been in the top 10 for 11 tries now, and we're exceptionally proud of him. Not only proud of John Baker and his approach to care of his dogs and his team, but we're proud of the canine athletes. He has a couple lead dogs, Velvet and Snicker, that are pretty incredible,